Welcome to the lands of science fiction stories. I wish you a pleasant listening experience.
The sterile lights of the Galactic Medical Institute's infirmary glowed dimly in the cold, lifeless chamber. Inside, advanced medical pods hummed with soft vibrations, filled with patients from across the stars, each one clinging to life in a meticulously maintained state of stasis. Dr. Urix Enyarvik, the Institute's chief xenobiologist, monitored the chamber with a detached air of professionalism. His many eyes flickered over the readouts displayed across the room, analyzing vital signs with cold precision. Beside him stood his assistant, Vinel, a young member of the translucent-skinned Elker species, whose tentacles twitched nervously. Despite his years of training, Vinel had yet to fully adjust to the unpredictability of the Institute's latest arrivals, humans. "These Terrans, they are unusual," Vinel murmured, eyeing the pod at the far end of the chamber, where an especially stubborn human warrior had been recovering. "Their physiology defies logic." Dr. Urix narrowed his eyes at the display screen showing the occupant of that pod. The readouts flickered irregularly, vital signs swinging back into stability, then edging towards chaos. The human inside was Lieutenant Riley Cass, a member of Earth's notorious Deathworlder Special Forces, known throughout the galaxy for their insane survival rates and reckless disregard for personal safety. She had been brought in after a brutal confrontation with an alien warlord, a battle that should have killed her. "Unusual doesn't begin to describe them," Dr. Urix grunted. "Their biology, it's madness. The injuries this one sustained would have liquefied most species." And yet, his voice trailed off, an eerie calmness taking over as he studied the readout. "She's healing. Fast." The pod containing Lieutenant Cass hissed softly as the oxygen mist swirled around her form. She looked deceptively peaceful, her battle-scarred face illuminated by the faint glow of the medical scanners. "Doctor," Vinel said hesitantly, "her vitals are stabilizing. More than that, she's waking up." "Impossible." Dr. Urix's voice echoed in disbelief, his many arms gesticulating frantically. He rushed to the pod, tapping commands into the panel with practiced efficiency. "We induced a coma to manage the trauma. She shouldn't be conscious for another 10 days at least." But as the doctor stared at the screen, the truth became undeniable. Riley Cass's brain activity had surged, the pod's readouts pinging wildly. Vinel, wide-eyed, took a step back as the pod's lid began to retract, revealing the figure inside. Her body was a tapestry of injuries, bruises, cuts, and fractures that would have ended the life of any other being. Yet here she was, not only alive but stirring. Slowly, impossibly, Lieutenant Riley Cass's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was only silence as her gaze swept the room, dazed but calculating. She groaned softly, sitting up with an alarming ease for someone who had been on death's doorstep mere hours ago. Her muscles tensed, and with a grunt, she swung her legs over the edge of the pod. "Lieutenant Cass," Dr. Urix said, voice carefully neutral. "You've sustained critical injuries and were placed in a coma to facilitate healing. You should remain still." Riley turned her head toward the doctor, a smirk pulling at the corner of her bloodied lips. "Yeah, Doc, I don't do well with shoulds." Her voice was hoarse, but the raw defiance in her tone was unmistakable. Vinal, who had been watching in horrified fascination, gasped. "But your body will heal. It always does." She pushed herself up, her body protesting with every movement, though she seemed to relish the pain. It was a sensation that reminded her she was alive. "Now, where's my gear?" "Lieutenant, you're not thinking clearly," Dr. Urix insisted, stepping in front of her. "Your injuries are a minor inconvenience," Riley interrupted. She flexed her fingers, wincing as she rotated her shoulder, still stiff from the dislocated joint that had been reset hours earlier. "Now, where is my gear?" The doctor's tentacles twitched in frustration. "You must understand, if you exert yourself, you risk permanent damage. Your vitals indicate—" "Look, Doc," Riley said, standing to her full height, towering over both Urix and Vinel. Her body was battered, yes, but her eyes burned with the intensity of a warrior who had unfinished business. "That bastard out there, he's still breathing. I'm not." Yurix recoiled slightly at the ferocity in her gaze, the chilling determination that he had only ever seen in a few beings across the stars. You wish to fight again? The one who did this to you? Riley smirked, cracking her knuckles. Oh, it's not a wish, Doc. It's a fact. He's not getting away that easily. Lieutenant Riley Cass moved through the corridors of the Galactic Medical Institute with an unsettling calm. Every step she took sent a ripple of pain through her still-healing body, but she welcomed it, used it as fuel. The cold metal beneath her boots reminded her that she was alive, that she had unfinished business. Her target, a Kronar warlord, had left her broken on the battlefield. Today, she would return the favor. Behind her, Dr. Yurix and Vinil hurried to catch up, their protests echoing down the halls. Lieutenant Cass, you cannot leave. You're in no condition to fight. Yurix called after her, his voice tinged with a mix of fear and frustration. Riley didn't bother looking back. I appreciate the concern, Doc, but I've got something to settle. Vinil, who had been watching her with a mixture of awe and terror, scuttled forward, his tentacles waving frantically. You must understand. The Kronar warlord, he's left the system. There's no need for this. You've already won. Riley's pace didn't falter, but her lips curled into a grim smile. What? He's still breathing. That means the fight isn't over. The trio burst into the hangar bay, where ships of all sizes were docked, preparing for various missions across the galaxy. Riley headed straight for one of the small, sleek spacecraft reserved for emergencies. She didn't need approval. Her mission was personal, and she wasn't about to let red tape stop her. Lieutenant Cass, please. Yurix shouted, moving in front of her at the last moment, blocking her path. His normally composed features were contorted with desperation. You're going to get yourself killed. Riley stopped, towering over the alien doctor. She met his many eyes with an intensity that made him flinch. Doc, you've been good to me, but you don't understand humans. We don't back down. Especially not when it's personal. Yurix hesitated, searching for something, anything, to change her mind. This warlord, he nearly killed you. Why risk everything now? Riley's eyes darkened, and her voice dropped to a low, deadly whisper. Because he made it personal when he decided to play God with my people. He'll regret leaving me alive. Without another word, she pushed past the doctor and climbed into the cockpit of the emergency craft. The door slid shut with a soft hiss, and the engines hummed to life. Yurix watched helplessly as the ship lifted off. She's mad, he muttered, completely mad. Vinal's wide eyes tracked the ship as it disappeared into the stars. Do you think she'll make it? Yurix let out a long, weary sigh. If there's one thing I've learned about humans, it's that they don't know when to quit. Riley stared at the void ahead of her as the stars streaked by. The coordinates were locked. She knew exactly where her target had fled. The Kronar warlord, Karn, had escaped their last encounter, but not unscathed. Her attacks had hurt him, wounded his pride. He was out there hiding, licking his wounds. But not for long. As the small craft entered the Kronar system, Riley's heartbeat quickened. The pain from her injuries was still fresh, but adrenaline dulled the sharp edges. She was a soldier. Pain was part of the job, and revenge was the mission. Her craft dropped out of hyperspace just beyond a small moon orbiting a barren planet. The sensors pinged, picking up the signature of Karn's warship. Riley's eyes narrowed. It was time. With expert precision, she maneuvered the craft toward the warship's docking bay. She knew the Kronar well. Proud, arrogant warriors. They wouldn't expect a human to come after them like this. Not alone. The ship landed with a soft thud in the warship's hangar. Riley wasted no time, grabbing her combat gear and strapping on the weapons she had brought. Her body screamed in protest with every movement, but she ignored it, focusing on one thing, Karn. She stepped out of the ship, her boots clanging on the cold metal floor of the hangar. The dim lights flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Riley's fingers tightened around her blaster as she moved swiftly toward the warship's interior. The corridors were empty, but she knew she was being watched. Kronar warriors never shied away from a confrontation, and Karn would want her brought to him. That was fine by her. As if on cue, two hulking Kronar warriors appeared at the far end of the corridor, their exoskeletons gleaming in the faint light. They blocked her path, massive axes in hand, but their faces twisted into sneers when they saw who stood before them. "A human," one of them growled. "Karn will enjoy breaking you again." Riley didn't respond. Instead, she surged forward, her blaster firing in rapid succession. The first Kronar staggered back as the shots struck his exposed joints. Before he could react, Riley was on him, driving a knife deep into the weak point of his armor. He let out a guttural scream before collapsing to the floor. The second warrior roared in fury, swinging his axe in a deadly arc. Riley ducked, the blade whistling just over her head. She countered with a kick to his knee, sending him stumbling. A swift punch to his neck finished the job, and the second warrior crumpled beside his fallen comrade. Breathing heavily, Riley wiped the blood from her face and continued down the corridor. The throne room was just ahead. Karn was waiting. The doors to the chamber slid open, revealing the towering figure of Karn sitting on his throne. His glowing red eyes narrowed as Riley stepped inside. His voice was a low rumble, filled with contempt. "You should have stayed dead, Terran." Riley smiled, her grip tightening on her blade. "Yeah, well, I'm not good at taking hints." Karn rose from his throne, his massive form casting a shadow over the room. His armor was scarred from their last battle, and his pride still smarted from the wounds she had inflicted. "You will die here, human. And this time I will make sure of it." Riley shrugged, her eyes gleaming with cold fury. "Maybe, but you're coming with me." With a roar, Karn charged, his axe raised high. Riley stood her ground, her blade flashing as she met his attack head-on. The force of the blow nearly knocked her off her feet, but she dug in, slashing at his exposed side. Karn howled in pain, but he was relentless, swinging his axe again and again, each strike aimed to end her. But Riley was faster. Despite the agony coursing through her body, she dodged and weaved, her blade cutting deep into his armor with each pass. Karn's fury grew with every miss, his attacks becoming wild, desperate. Finally, with a move born of sheer willpower, Riley ducked under a wild swing and drove her blade into the base of Karn's skull. The warlord froze, his body shuddering before collapsing to the ground with a deafening crash. For a moment, Riley stood over him, breathing hard, her body trembling from exhaustion. She stared down at Karn's lifeless form, her chest heaving with each ragged breath. It was over. She sank to her knees, the adrenaline fading, leaving only the sharp bite of her injuries. The fight had taken everything from her, but she had won. As the room grew silent, Riley allowed herself a small, tired smile. Never bet against a human. Riley's breathing echoed loudly in the cockpit as she hurtled through the void of space toward the Kronar warlord's last known location. Every movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her body, but she bit down the discomfort. Pain was temporary. Her mission was all that mattered. The coordinates on her console blinked as her small ship approached the warlord's hideout, an abandoned asteroid mining station, now repurposed into a fortress. Her heart raced at the sight of the massive structure looming in the distance. Karn was inside, waiting, likely unaware that she was coming for him. He thought she was dead. Soon he would wish she had stayed that way. The ship docked smoothly in a darkened hangar bay, the dim glow of emergency lights casting eerie shadows on the cold steel walls. Riley moved quickly, her feet silent against the deck as she gathered her weapons. She felt the familiar weight of her blade, her blaster, and a handful of grenades strapped to her belt. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. As she exited the ship, the silence in the hangar was oppressive. The Kronar warriors who had once been stationed there were nowhere to be seen. Riley didn't care, she knew Karn's arrogance. He wouldn't expect anyone, especially not a wounded human, to challenge him on his home turf. She made her way through the winding corridors, her steps growing more deliberate as she neared the central chamber. Her fingers tightened around the grip of her blaster, ready for whatever might await her on the other side of the massive doors that led to Karn's throne room. The doors slid open with a slow, mechanical groan, revealing a cavernous hall lit by flickering torches. At the far end, Karn sat on a stone throne, his hulking form almost too large for the seat. His red eyes glowed in the dim light, and his tusked mouth twisted into a cruel smile as he saw her enter. "Lieutenant Cass," Karn's deep voice boomed, filling the room. "You should have stayed dead." Riley didn't answer, her expression hard as steel as she stepped into the room. Her body was on fire with pain, but she pushed it down, feeding on the adrenaline surging through her veins. She wasn't here for banter. She was here to end this. "You made a mistake," Riley said, her voice low and dangerous. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Karn chuckled, the sound deep and guttural. "You think you can kill me, Terran? I left you broken on the battlefield. You're nothing." He rose to his full height, towering over her as he stepped forward, his massive fists clenched at his sides. His armor, scarred from their previous battle, gleamed in the firelight. Without another word, Riley fired. The blaster bolt hit Karn square in the chest, but his armor absorbed the shot, sending the energy sizzling across the surface. He barely flinched. With a roar, Karn charged, his heavy boots shaking the ground as he moved. Riley dove to the side, narrowly avoiding his crushing blow. Her body screamed in protest, but she rolled to her feet, already moving again. She fired several more shots, each one aimed at the weak points in his armor, but Karn was relentless, closing the distance with terrifying speed. "You can't win, Terran," Karn bellowed, swinging his massive fist toward her. She ducked under the blow, feeling the wind of its passing as it smashed into the wall behind her, leaving a dent in the metal. Riley didn't waste time. She rolled behind him, slashing her blade across the back of his leg. Karn howled in pain, stumbling forward, but he wasn't down yet. He spun with surprising speed, catching Riley with a backhanded strike that sent her crashing into the ground. She gasped, the impact knocking the wind out of her as pain exploded across her chest. For a moment, the world spun, but Riley forced herself to focus. Karn was already coming at her again, his fists raised to deliver a finishing blow. But she wasn't finished yet. With a surge of adrenaline, Riley rolled to her feet just as Karn swung down. His fist slammed into the ground where she had been lying, cracking the floor beneath him. Before he could recover, Riley lunged, driving her blade deep into his side, piercing through the weaker joint of his armor. Karn roared in pain, but his massive hand shot out, grabbing her by the throat and lifting her off the ground. Riley gasped, struggling as his grip tightened, cutting off her air. Her vision darkened at the edges, and for a moment, she felt the cold fingers of death reaching for her. But she wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. With the last of her strength, Riley reached for the grenade on her belt, pulling the pin with trembling fingers. She shoved it into the gap in Karn's armor where her blade had struck, locking eyes with him as she spoke through gritted teeth. "Die, you bastard." She kicked off his chest, breaking free of his grip and rolling away just as the grenade exploded. The blast rocked the chamber, sending smoke and debris flying in all directions. Karn's roar was cut short as the explosion tore through him, ripping his massive body apart. Riley lay on the ground, coughing as the smoke filled her lungs. Her vision swam, but she forced herself to her feet, staggering toward Karn's fallen form. His body was broken, the once imposing warlord reduced to a mangled heap of armor and flesh. It was over. She had won. But as Riley stood over Karn's corpse, her body finally gave in. Her legs buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, the pain and exhaustion overwhelming her. She stared up at the ceiling, gasping for breath as darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. "Never bet against a human," she whispered, her lips curling into a faint smile before the world went black. Back at the Galactic Medical Institute, Dr. Urix and Vinal watched in stunned silence as the monitors tracking Riley's ship went dark. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over them like a heavy shroud. "Did she?" Vinal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Urix let out a long, weary sigh, his many eyes closing in resignation. "I don't know. But if there's one thing I've learned about humans, it's that they don't die easy." Far across the galaxy, in the ruins of the Kronar warlord's fortress, Lieutenant Riley Cass lay motionless, her body broken but her spirit unyielding. The fight was over, but her legend would live on, whispered in hushed tones across the stars. Because no one, no matter how powerful, could ever truly defeat a Deathworlder. End of story.